It's my great pleasure to introduce Reverend Marti Keller. She is a minister with the Unitarian Universalist Women's Federation. She has been a UU parish and community minister for 21 years. Prior to ordination, she was a journalist, cultural critic, and advocate on behalf of women and families. Marti self-defines as a Unitarian, a lifelong Unitarian Universalist who identifies as culturally Jewish. She was the co-editor of Jewish Voices in Unitarian Universalism from Skinner House Books, author of the UU pamphlet on Jewish people within UU, and past president and present board member of UU's for Jewish Awareness. She is a member of the Society for Humanistic Judaism and a former member of its executive committee, and now serves on the advisory team for the Secular Synagogue, a multi-generational international virtual Jewish community. The title of her sermon today is Yes to Life, the views of Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl. Thank you, Marti.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you so much. And thank all of you for being here today. This is really tough stuff. It's a really tough stuff. And I appreciate in the midst of all the tough stuff that we're still all going through, your being with us, with me on Holocaust Remembrance Week. Putting this talk together, I have to admit, was emotionally very difficult for me. While I was researching and reflecting and creating this talk, I kept by my side at my laptop computer where I write these things, 3 photos, pictures that were taken by my husband when we traveled to Czechoslovakia and Poland a few years back. One was of a synagogue in Krakow, an old synagogue that was no longer in use. One was of the square where the Jews that lived in the Krakow ghetto that was proximate to the square were told to come to be transported to what they thought were work camps, which we know were not work camps, were concentration camps. Actually, that square was one of the scenes in Schindler's List, the music you just heard, and one of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. The tourists were shown on a popular bus tour. Sometimes they were only shown the camp, the displays of thousands and thousands of eyeglasses and suitcases, and the cramped barracks of the human beings stacked in bunks, and the electric wire fences surrounding it all, and the ovens and the chimneys so close to the nearby town. And sometimes the concentration camp tour was coupled with a tour of the local salt mine as well, with stops, it is advertised, for refreshments. The concentration camp photograph you were shown is most likely familiar to many of you because there have been so many movies and so many documentaries and otherwise ways that they have been used, these scenes, the pastoral scenes of this particular concentration camp. It very well could have been Dachau in other camps as well. And I must confess, I am nearly numbed to them. This was not the setting, however, for my father's family's Holocaust, or rather the Holocaust of his landsmen, which means neighbors and family friends, those that were still in Sheptovka during the war, those people who had not secretly escaped Sheptovka, since the Russian government forbid Jews from leaving that area beyond the Pale. In Ukraine, years before, fleeing from murderous pogroms, from involuntary conscription in the Russian army. Fortunately, my entire extended family escaped before the door to America was slammed shut in 1924. The photo of the Holocaust for the remaining Jews in Sheptovka would have been a picture like those dozens I Googled looking for Holocaust in Sheptovka. And frankly, the photos were too hard for me to share. They were pictures of people shot in ditches that they had dug for their own mass graves in the Tepuka forest a place other Russians had gone for summer vacations. My grandfather remembered to smell the pine air. There had been earlier murders of Sheptovkin Jews in the ghetto that the Nazis had created. But in 1942, June 1942, the first mass graves, the first mass shootings happened, and the second in September of 1942, 4,000 people in total, probably all, if not all, of the Jews in Sheptovka. This was part of what they called the Ukrainian Holocaust, carried out by the German army with the help of around 100,000 Ukrainians, local militia, neighbors of the Jews in the towns where they lived, murdered more than 1 million Jews. May these Jews and others be blessed in memory. Last May, our Unitarian Universalist Beacon Press, in its Beacon Broadside blog, recognized that the COVID-19 pandemic was settling in around the country, and they were not wrong, and the world with its lockdowns and sheltering in place, and ours, therefore, to rediscover or intensify our reading lives. I think very cleverly, they issued a list of Beacon Press titles. One list was books we could get lost in. One list was books on remaking society once we were through the worst of it. And then there was a list of books that could inspire. Among the books that they felt could inspire us in this hard time were some of the writings by Martin Luther King Jr., who, I don't know if you know, but Beacon Press holds the rights to publish all of Martin Luther King Jr.'s work. And then there were 2 books by Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, whose book, Man's Search for Reading. I'd be interested to know how many of you have read it. Raise your hand if you have read that book, which has indeed inspired millions of readers and has been held up as one of the 10 most influential books in America by the Library of Congress. This and his recently released English translations of public lectures that he delivered very shortly after the war, Yes to Life, Despite Everything, are the sources of my talk today. A reflection on the Holocaust remembrance, but most particularly how we make meaning. The canon of Holocaust literature has been primarily Western and secular, in part having to do with the structural features, the chronology of the Holocaust, because it's no coincidence that the major writers, I think those most familiar to us, Anne Frank, Elie Wiesel, Simon Wiesenthal, and Primo Levi, all remained free until 1944. Levi and Wiesel, because their countries only then came under German rule. Frank, as we know, because she hid in an attic in Amsterdam for 2 years. By then, the Nazis were losing the war, quite frankly, and they were more interested in extracting labor from Jewish prisoners than in the extraordinary logistics, even for them, of mass extermination. A person deported to Auschwitz in 1944 had a very, very thin chance of surviving. Out of the 650 Jews in Primo Levi's trained to the camp, only 20 survived the war. Whereas a Jew captured by the Germans in Poland in 1942, out of these Jews, they had virtually no chance of survival at all. Out of almost 1 million Jews in the Treblinka camp that year, only 67 survived. As I said earlier, almost 2 million probably. The original figures were really lowballed, but we're thinking closer to 2 million Jews were killed in what they call the Holocaust by bullets, shot by German soldiers and local collaborators in scattered mass graves, not only in smaller places like Sheptovka, but in Babi Yar, at least 30,000 massacred in only 2 days. These Jews included already writers and potential writers among them who never stood a chance, whose writing would never been read. So I'm going to share a little bit of the Holocaust writing from people we're familiar with. All of them, I said, Western and secular. From Anne Frank, very, very famous, probably the most famous quote. Despite everything, I believe people are really good at heart. And then this from her diary as well. Who has influenced this inflicted this upon us, Who has made us Jews different from other people? Who has allowed us to suffer so terribly up until now? If we bear this suffering, and if there are any Jews left when it is all over, then Jews, instead of being doomed, will be held up as an example. Who knows, it might even be our religion from which the world and all people will learn good. And for that reason, and reason alone, do we have to suffer now? From Eli Wiesel, I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides wherever men or women are persecuted because of their race, because of their religion or their political views. That place must at that moment become the center of the universe. From the dead and the living, we must bear witness. From Simon Wiesenthal, for evil to flourish, it requires only good men to do nothing. From Primo Levi, monsters exist, but they are too few in number to be truly dangerous. Most dangerous are the common men, the functionaries ready to believe and to act without asking questions. And finally, from Viktor Frankl, everything can be taken from a person, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in a given set of circumstances, to choose one's way. Given the Holocaust and the damage wreaked on Viktor Frankl's career and personal life, it has been said that it was a minor miracle that his work was ever published at all. He was born in Vienna in 1905. He was a prominent high school psychology student. He sent a paper to Freud, Sigmund Freud, who wanted to publish it. He worked in clinics. He specialized in suicide, especially suicides of teenage girls. He opened a private practice, which the Nazis shut down in 1938 when they took over Austria. And in 1942, Viktor Frankl's family was taken to Auschwitz. The manuscript that would become Man's Search for Meaning had already been drafted. In other words, it didn't come out of his camp experiences. He had already been thinking about how you make meaning when Frankl was arrested and deported with his family. He had sewn the manuscript into his coat. He thought that would protect it, only to have all of his clothes stripped from him and all of his body hair shaved off. Once he had made the cut, is a very crude way of saying it, once he was not selected for the gas chambers, but was held back. They stripped him and took away everything and shaved every bit of his body hair. Frankl recalled that most of us, he said, were overcome by a grim sense of humor. He wrote, "We knew that we had nothing to lose, but our ridiculously naked selves." Frank spent time while at hard labor or being marched from camp to camp in his head, recreating his book and transcribing it into little stolen pieces of paper, then titled The Doctor and the Soul. The rediscovered, previously untranslated lectures that make up the just published Yes to Life in Spite of Everything were delivered a scant 11 months after he was liberated from a labor camp, where a short time before, by all reports, he had been on the brink of death. So what was Frankl's Holocaust life like, and how did that influence his sense of meaning? Turkheim, Dachau, Ford's labor camp, was where he was sent after his process at Auschwitz for selection. As I said, 95% were gassed. He was among that small group of mostly men who were permitted to go and do some service for the Nazis instead of being immediately annihilated. In that camp, in that labor camp, there were 30,000 prisoners between 1944 and 1945. He described the admission, survival shock, and the tendency for the people that had temporarily been saved to look at the electric wire fence and decide that maybe it would be better for them to run into it, to commit suicide, to be in control of their own deaths, because they figured that death was going to happen to them in any case. As I said, they were completely stripped down, they were shaved, all their possessions were taken. They were living a literally naked existence. He described their personhood as being melted down, all of their ambition destroyed, the urge for self-realization in its most essential form taken away from them. So what was left for Frankl and for others was to focus on remaining fit for work. All the rest, he wrote, was meaningless. He learned to shave daily was something he found so he could look more rosy. And it came down to primitive desires when he was working: bread and coffee and cigarettes, maybe a bath. And the inmates made up elaborate meals that they would give to each other when they were finally liberated. But mostly, the object was to disappear into the mass so as not to draw attention. If you were in the mass, if you were in the middle and not on the sides, you wouldn't be noticed if you faltered, if you were no longer to work productively. Your inner life, he wrote, was reduced to a minimum. You survived only for today, and deadly apathy was the major survival mechanism. But he noticed that not all of the prisoners regressed. Freedom, he noticed, still existed to respond differently to the circumstances. Human souls could be strengthened by experience of burdens within limits, and being in a concentration camp was at the limit of people's ability to survive. If you could hold on to a future, even if the future was eternity, when would liberation come was a question that could keep you alive when apathy could kill. While at forced labor or being marched hungry and sore with swollen legs, Frankl would imagine he was standing before a university lectern, educating his students on the psychology of the concentration camp. He would do this over and over and over again, and the words that he made up in his head on the walks at labor were the words that came in his lectures and his later writing. Right after liberation, the camp commander, who had been relatively kind, at least Frankl thought he was relatively kind, allowed the inmates to bury their dead, the remaining dead, and to scratch the names of the dead on the bark of a fir tree. All the while, these liberated inmates, knowing that the best had not necessarily been those that survived, that they had undeserved mercy that had been given to them, that there was no judgment about who had lived and who had died, just how they had lived before they died. They owed their dead comrades to be grateful, he said, to bless the smallest pieces of bread, to be thankful to have a bed, to be thankful not to have to stand in roll call in the cold, and not to be in constant danger of death. Though he was liberated in April of 1945, Frankl was not returned to Vienna and to any kind of normal life until August of that year. And when he returned, he got the news that his mother had been immediately gassed in Auschwitz, and that his pregnant wife, Tilly, had died of typhus in a camp. He already had known that his father and his brother had died. And this is a letter that he wrote to some friends at that time. I am terribly tired, terribly sad, terribly lonely, nothing more to hope for, and nothing more to fear. I have no pleasure in life, only duties, and I live out of my conscience. I feel distant from everything. It all says nothing to me, means nothing. In the camps, we believed that we had reached the lowest point. Now I have nothing more than to cry a little and browse through Psalms. My only consolation is that I can say that in all good conscience that I realized the opportunities that presented themselves to me in the midst of all. So maybe you will laugh at me and maybe you will be angry at me, but I do not contradict myself in the least. I take back nothing of my old affirmation of life when I experience the things I have described. If I had not had this rock solid, positive attitude to life, what would have become of me during those weeks and those months in the camps? But I see things in another dimension now. Increasingly, I realize that life is so infinitely meaningful that in suffering and even in failure, there still has to be some meaning. So at the depths of his return, the worse, he said, than his experiences in the camp, he found a way to pick himself up and go on with his life. He remarried eventually. He wrote 26 books. That first book, Man's Search for Meaning, has been translated into 23 languages, 9 million copies. It is the second most widely read Holocaust book in the Holocaust Museum, even though it never mentions Jews. He founded a school and the Institutes of Logotherapy, which means a therapy of meaning. A therapy of meaning asks two questions only in therapy. What does life at this moment demand of us? And do we have the courage to suffer? He has been and was an unabated influence, and he had a lecture edited for TED Talk years after his death. They took a lecture he had done actually for KQED public television in San Francisco, and they turned it into a TED Talk. And as you know, TED Talks are, you can't use notes. I apologize. You don't have a lectern. You use a lapel mic, and you don't talk very long, and you repeat what you have to say to give people the most essential message you have to give out in this world. So I'm going to make an attempt to recreate or create a Frankl TED Talk. I'm not going to talk for 18 minutes. I am going to use notes. But this is the TED Talk I think he might have delivered if he was alive today. He actually lived a long life. He died in 1997. He was in his 90s. So here are Frankl's 3 pillars. 1, not pleasure, which is what Sigmund Freud thought drove us, or power, which is what Adler thought drove us, but meaning drives our lives. The other 2 can happen as a result of finding meaning, but the main way we seek meaning in this life is through that. Life never ceases to hold meaning, he thought, even in a concentration camp or any other horrific situation. And 3, we have the freedom of will. Life, he said, means being questioned and answering. We are responsible for our existence. Life is not a given. Life is given over to us with a task in every moment. For religious people, they might describe it as a divine mission. He actually had some sense of God, a sort of super being that gave him some direction, but he always emphasized that this meaning therapy, this meaning that he thought would be the driving force in our life, was secular as well as religious. Life is not something, it is an opportunity for something. So how do we find and make meaning out of our lives? Number 1, through our actions, what he called our duty, what he called our single huge obligation, out of which happiness may arise, not as a goal, but an outcome. 2nd, through loving the arts, loving nature, loving each other. He would have been a perfect universalist. He believed that love was the most overriding thing in our life. And 3, and this is the hardest for us, through suffering. If all of life has meaning, so does suffering. Sometimes endurance is the highest achievement. It is not only the uniqueness of an individual life that gives importance, it is the uniqueness of every hour, every day, every moment. It is not the totality of our life that's unique, but what we bring into every single day of our life. It is not just our individuality that has value for its own sake, but individuality that matters for the human community. He described this as radiating. We radiate into the world the waves that emanate from our being. The questions life asks us, and answering which we can realize the meaning of the present moment, does not only change from hour to hour, he believed, but also changes from person to person. The question is entirely different in each moment for every individual. There is no one meaning in life. There is no one purpose in life. There are meanings. There are purposes. What can we create? What can we experience? How can we suffer daily and for eternity? Every single moment contains thousands of possibilities. If I can only choose one, I can only choose one, and I can actualize it. Without belief in meaningfulness of human existence, there is only despair, he wrote, self-murder. It's not a matter of looking at a balance sheet of negatives and positives and living and deciding that that's when life has meaning at all. Not what I can expect from life, but what can life expect from me? It is not us that ask questions about the meaning of life. It is life that asks questions and directs questions at us. Life itself means nothing more than being questioned. Our whole act of being is nothing more than being responsible towards life. That's the basis of Frankl's work and the basis of his passion. And if you heard meaning and meaning and meaning all over in it, I am sure his TED Talk would be pounding it. word after word after word. It started in his head before he went to the concentration camp. It stayed in his head all the years he was in a concentration camp. It came out in 9 days after he left the concentration camp, and it's been with us ever since. So he believed there was a possibility for what he called a new humanity. We must strive for this new humanity, expecting more of ourselves, not less, even in the light of all the horrors that he saw and all the horrors he learned about. He thought we expected too little of ourselves, not too much. What is human is still valid. It's all a question of individual human beings. That's what remains, not money, power, fame, health, happiness, vanity, ambition, but our essential selves, that essential self that he had to discover when he was alone in a concentration camp and returned alone to Vienna. Everything depends on individual human beings, each person's actions, creatively making the meaning of life a reality in his or her own being. But on the average, he realized people are too sluggish to shoulder this responsibility. It's difficult to recognize and difficult to commit to saying yes to these responsibilities and therefore yes to life. To say yes to life is not only meaningful under all circumstances, because life is, it's also possible, this new humanity, this new approach to life under all circumstances, despite hardship and death, and despite suffering. Under any kind of fate, such as concentration camps, we have no control over the context of our lives, he came to believe. It's yes to life, despite everything. May it be so.